Welcome to the podcast of the Dublin Bible Talks, midweek Bible talks for workers in Dublin. I'm Cameron Jones. Leaders with charisma, popularity, success and power are great, but what if a leader starts heading to failure and expects you to go down with him? Well, that's what we find in Luke chapter 9. And please consider joining us live on Wednesdays from your workplace, 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom. It's a simple way of identifying as a Christian in your workplace. Simply use the link bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. That's bit.ly/DublinBibleTalks. Why do people follow certain leaders? A major global leadership study released by Gallup this year surveyed people across more than 50 countries, asking what they wanted from a leader. And the strongest answers were things like hope and trust and confidence and stability. Now, by this point in Luke's Gospel, the disciples know that Jesus is no ordinary man. They've seen him command storms and demons and sickness and even death itself. And now Jesus forces a key question out into the open. Who do you say that I am? But it becomes clear that recognizing who Jesus is really just the beginning. The harder question is whether you are willing to follow where he's going. Let's have a look at chapter 9, verse 18 to 20 to start off with. And in this section, we're talking about the Christ revealed but misunderstood. So first of all, the great question, who is Jesus? Now it happened, it says, that he was praying alone and his disciples were with him, and he asked them, who do the crowd say that I am? And they answered, John the Baptist. But others say Elijah, and others that one of the prophets of old had risen. And then he said to them, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered, the Christ of God. Thus far in the account of the real Jesus, Luke has focused on this key question, who is this man? Who is this man that commands storms, who puts unclean spirits where they belong, who raises the dead? Even Herod asked the question last week and wondered almost exactly the same things as the crowds wonder in this response of the disciples. But now we find the key question on Jesus' lips, asking his disciples, who do the crowds say that I am? And the crowds have plenty of opinions. John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets returned. They recognize Jesus as extraordinary. They recognize he is sent from God, that he's powerful, that he's prophetic. But we readers, surely we have realized already, surely we have heard enough from Jesus to know that he's not just another prophet. He's not just another preacher. In response to Jesus' direct question, Peter says it plainly, you are the Christ of God. Now that is the turning point in this account of Jesus presented to us by Luke, the result of his detailed historical research, the recognition, the declaration that the disciples recognize Jesus is God's promised king. He is the ruler of all of God's world and the keeper of all of God's promises. He is the one that all God's promises have been pointing towards. Now, I reckon one of the best movies ever made is one called The Princess Bride, and if you haven't seen it, you should see it very soon. And in that film, there is one portion where one character keeps on saying the word inconceivable. And at one stage, another one of the characters says to this person, you keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Peter has used the word Christ. He has used that word, but it does not mean what he thinks it means. And so rather than going into a great celebration of this realization, Jesus goes on in verse 21 and 22, and he strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one, saying, the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and the third day be raised. See, this is not the time to gather an army. This is not the beginning of a political revolution. This is the Son of Man must suffer. Must. Did you notice he used that word? That word matters. Jesus is not describing some tragic accident or political miscalculation that is just up ahead. No, he is talking about divine necessity. This is God's plan. The Christ must suffer. And not just suffer physically. Notice the language. Suffer many things and be rejected. Rejected by the very people who should recognize him. The elders, the chief priests, the scribes. The religious leaders of Israel will look directly at God's promised king and refuse him. Humanity does not just misunderstand God's king. Humanity resists him because we do not think that we need the medicine that he has come to give. We don't naturally believe that we are sick, and so we don't think we need Dr. Jesus. Jesus is not the kind of Messiah people want. They want power, they want victory, they want national triumph for the good guys like us. He's their Messiah. He must be about to enter into their cause and join them in their work. But Jesus says his road, the road appointed by God, the word pointed to by the scriptures, is very different. It is suffering, rejection, shameful death, and then resurrection. Jesus joins the glorious identity of the Son of Man with suffering and death. See, there is the great reversal that is at the heart of the gospel. The glorious King conquers not first by destroying his enemies, but by giving himself over to suffering. And to see how difficult we find this to understand, even today, might be when we look at things of what is now called Christian nationalism or muscular Christianity, the elevation of the crusader spirit, seeking that kind of worldly victory. And it seems to me that those kinds of things align much more closely with the definition of Christ that this age has, that Jesus is dismantling. So we should be very careful as we look at the disciples' struggle to understand. If you start in this section to get at all frustrated with their slowness, just look again at yourself. Look again at what Jesus says plainly about the kind of Christ he is. The Christ of God must suffer and be rejected, be killed, and then rise. And this is the only cure for sinners. Sinners like the disciples. Sinners like you and me. And this type of Christ has an impact on what it means to be his disciple. It has an impact of what it means to be a follower of this Christ. Verse 23, and he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. It is one thing for Jesus to say he will suffer. But now he says that if you follow him, your life will take the same shape. The disciples may have imagined that following the King of God himself would mean influence and victory and honour and greatness and glory. But Jesus immediately dismisses those expectations. He dismantles them. If anyone would come after me, anyone, not just the 12, not just Christian leaders. This is the shape of all Christian discipleship. Anyone. And then he says, let him deny himself. See, this is not just a call to abstain from certain pleasures occasionally. This is not giving up chocolate for Lent. This is not a temporary practice of self-discipline, and it's not even a call to asceticism. He says, deny yourself. The centre of fallen humanity is the desire for self-rule. My will, my desires, my control, my life on my terms. Jesus says discipleship means renouncing our right to rule ourselves. And this is what the alternative to self-rule looks like. It looks like take up your cross daily. We hear that language so often that we, I think, lose how shocking it really is. As Jesus says this, the cross is not yet a religious symbol. It is not jewellery. It is not metaphorical inconvenience. It is not just my cross to bear. Picture a man carrying a cross towards his own execution. That is what Jesus says following him looks like. Not to earn salvation through suffering, but being his disciple means following him along the same road daily. Not one dramatic moment of sacrifice, but a way of daily life, daily death to self-rule, daily dependence on him alone. And it's a life, we find out, verse 24, is a life of paradox. Whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and yet loses or forfeits himself? A person may gain success and wealth and influence and comfort and reputation and achievement and still lose the only life that ultimately matters. Verse 26, for whoever is ashamed of me and of my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory. Oh, glory is coming. And remember the Old Testament, glory is terrifying. Glory is something we need to be protected from. It is something we need a veil to be between us and the glorious one. Otherwise we will be destroyed. Jesus is saying that the Son of Man who suffers is also the Son of Man of glory. So how you receive him really matters. His glory is really the point of the next account. The glory revealed, but still misunderstood, is what the second section of our passage is dealing with today. The first part begins with the glory of the Son being revealed, verses 28 to 36. About 8 days after these sayings, he took with him Peter and John and James and went up the mountain to pray. It's about a week after the revelation of his path through suffering to glory, and Jesus takes 3 of his disciples up a mountain. And as soon as we hear that, our Old Testament memories are buzzing. You know the link between the mountain and God's glory. You know that two individuals at least have encountered God's glory on the mountain. And suddenly, verse 29, the appearance of Jesus' face was altered and his clothing became dazzling white. For a moment, in this moment, this veil is pulled back and the glory of Jesus becomes visible, and 2 others show up, Moses and Elijah. And these 2 are significant for 2 reasons. First of all, these 2 men are the men who went up on the mountain and encountered the glory of God themselves. And here, again, we find them up on a mountain meeting in glory. And who is it that they meet? They meet Jesus in glory at the top of the mountain. The second thing is, these 2 characters represent something in the Old Testament. Moses is the one through whom the law was given. Elijah is the prophet from whom the whole prophetic tradition of the Old Testament flows. And so here in glory we have the law and the prophets both testifying to the glory of Jesus. As Jesus has said back in Luke chapter 4 verse 21, he is the fulfillment of all the law and the prophets. And they have a conversation. And look at what it is that they discuss. Luke tells us, they spoke of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now that word departure there is the word exodus. They spoke of his exodus. Just as once God delivered his people through the exodus under Moses, Jesus is about to accomplish a greater deliverance at Jerusalem. Notice again the path of deliverance runs through suffering and death. Even in the midst of unveiled glory, the cross remains central. The glory points us toward the cross, not away from it. The word accomplish there is the word fulfill. That same word that Jesus used in 4:21, describing the relationship between Isaiah's words, the prophetic words, and him. And so we have, just in that little discussion, again the emphasis of the law and the prophets together pointing to Jesus. After the resurrection in chapter 24, as he's about to ascend, Jesus says, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." Then he opened their minds to understand the Scriptures and said to them, "Thus it is written, that the Christ should suffer and on the third day rise from the dead." In verse 32, Luke wants us to know that this wasn't a hallucination. They might have been heavy with sleep, but now they're fully awake. And Peter speaks, and what he says shows that he doesn't yet understand what's going on. "Master, it's good that we're here. Let's make 3 tents." And Luke tells us he didn't know what he was saying. Peter still doesn't get it. The kingdom will not come through Jesus' glory staying on the mountain. Jesus must go down. Jesus must go to Jerusalem and fulfill the Exodus. And then in verse 34, we read a cloud comes and overshadows them. Again, our Old Testament senses are tingling. Deeply biblical imagery where the cloud is associated with the glorious presence of God himself, the glory cloud of Sinai that led the people through the desert in the Exodus, the cloud that filled the temple, the visible sign of God's dwelling among his people. And the disciples are rightly terrified. Israel weren't permitted close to Sinai when God came upon it on the cloud. Aaron's sons approached God's glory in the tabernacle, and it broke out against them and they were destroyed. But just like at Sinai, out of the cloud of glory comes God's voice, God's words. And here he says, "This is my son, my chosen one, listen to him." That's the key to understanding what Luke is all about. It's actually the key to understanding life. Listen to Jesus. Listen to him. And take note of the law of Moses, which were given in God's own words. Listen to him. And then suddenly the moment ends. The cloud lifts. Moses and Elijah are gone, and Jesus stands alone with his disciples. But the meaning remains. Jesus is the fulfillment of all the law and the prophets. The whole of the Old Testament is all about him. And the Father directs our attention toward him. And Jesus stands at the centre of God's saving plan, the fulfillment, the true Exodus. He really is the glorious one. And from this point on, the road to Jerusalem becomes the full focus of Luke's account. We now know who Jesus is and what he must do. But before we get to Jesus setting his face toward Jerusalem, we've got another couple of stories that Luke thinks are really important for us to hear, and they are terribly frustrating in the light of what we've just had revealed to us. But they are also a challenge to our own understanding of Jesus. Do we get it? Verses 37 to 45, we have the failure of the disciples revealed. Coming down from the mountain, Luke brings us sharply back to the brokenness of this world. And we find a desperate father emerging from the crowd. Verse 37, "Teacher, I beg you, look upon my son. He's my only child. The boy is tormented by an unclean spirit." We've seen this before, haven't we? But then comes the very painful line, "I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not." Earlier in the chapter, Jesus had given the disciples authority over demons, and you surely we're asking, what's happened? Jesus reveals the problem in verse 41, "O faithless and twisted generation." The issue here is not a lack of technique. The issue here is not a lack of training or experience. The issue here is a sinful unbelief. Friends, so often we misunderstand faith. I remember last week, Jairus' public confidence was no more effective than the nameless woman with bleeding who came so timidly. See, what makes faith effective is not the quantity of faith, but the object of faith. Faith means to believe. Faith means to trust. It means to depend. The power of faith is outside the one doing the believing. It's outside the one doing the trusting and the depending. We believe the believable. We trust the trustworthy. We depend on the depend-able, on the thing that is faithful. Look again at what that desperate man said. "I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not." No, they can't do it. The disciples are as helpless as the crowd. They are as helpless as the father, as helpless as the boy himself. They could not do it. But Jesus speaks, and the demon obeys. Just like the storm, just like the other demons, just like death, just like creation. And we're presented here with that contrast that the one who must suffer is still the one with authority over all the world. And just in case we missed that, Luke adds in verse 43, "All were astonished at the majesty of God," as Jesus did this. And to smash our faces into the mind-bending contrast of the true gospel of Jesus Christ, having demonstrated again his power and authority, he then again says, verse 44, "Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man, the glorious one, is about to be delivered into the hands of men." The authority of Jesus and his suffering are not mutually exclusive. They are integrally connected. It is only the one who has the authority of God himself who can suffer in our place and bring forgiveness. But still we read in verse 45, "They did not understand this saying, and it was concealed from them that they may not perceive it, and they were afraid to ask him about this saying." There's still a kind of spiritual blindness operating. But like Jesus has said about the parables, the disciples, like the crowds, are ever hearing but not understanding, even the disciples, even the apostles. What happens in 46 to 48 is painful in its irony. Jesus is still talking about the cross and walking toward it, but the disciples are still talking about their status. But as we read that, and as maybe we get frustrated with them, be careful about judging the speck that is in their eye, because we might have a plank in our own. Don't you have a desire for a little greatness? For a little recognition, for a little significance, a little influence, a little importance, a little honour? I mean, for me, the temptation remains. Why do I want the Dublin Bible Talks to grow, to be more successful, to get more people, to have a more impressive ministry, so that Cameron's ministry is recognised? Jesus completely overturns such things. Verse 47, "But Jesus, knowing the reasoning of their hearts, took a child and put him by his side." The child has no power, no influence, no social importance. Oh, yes, they're loved, but what value do they add to the household economy? They are completely and utterly dependent on their parents. And Jesus says, "Whoever receives this child in my name receives me." Greatness in the kingdom of God is not measured by status. It is revealed in humility, welcoming the lowly, identifying with the insignificant, receiving those who the world naturally overlooks. And he says, "For he who is least among you is the one who is great. Doesn't that fit perfectly with everything we've been learning from Luke's account of Jesus? Everything he's been showing us about the real Jesus of real history? But the disciples still don't understand it. But the question is, do we? do our colleagues and friends get it? Despite how much they may already know and have already heard, they are still blind. But the disciples still have more to learn about the power of this new kingdom. Verse 49. We saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he doesn't follow with us. He's not part of our group. He's not inside our circle. He's not one of us. You see, the disciples still think the kingdom belongs to them in some way. And perhaps there we have a little jealousy too. The disciples have just failed to cast out a demon themselves, and they find some other person doing it successfully in Jesus' name. You notice that? In his name, in your name, they said. And Jesus immediately corrects them, don't stop him. For the one who is not against us, against you is for you. Jesus is not building a small, self-protective inner circle, obsessed with status and control. Christianity, dear friends, is not an exclusive club. The apostles might have had a special role, but their role is not the point or the power. The point and the power is found in Jesus and his kingdom, the word of which anyone can carry, even you and me. But the central question in this section is this: what kind of Christ are we willing to follow, and where will we follow him? See, the disciples have seen extraordinary things. They've even done extraordinary things. They've even confessed, you are the Christ of God. 3 of them have seen his glory with their own eyes, even heard the voice of the Father, this is my Son, listen to him. And yet they still struggle and still fail to understand, because the deepest stumbling block is not recognizing that Jesus is the Christ of glory with authority and power. It is recognized in accepting that the Christ of a glory and authority and power is the one who must suffer, be rejected, die, and then rise in glory. A king like that calls his followers to walk the same road of humble dependence, of self-denial, and cross-shaped discipleship. So the question Luke is presenting us with is not merely who is Jesus. I mean, that's now been revealed. The question is, will we follow him as he truly is? He is not a king like we would naturally invent. He's not the kind of one who takes us straight into impressive victory and glory, but he is the suffering Christ revealed in the gospel, who calls us to suffer along behind him. And dear friends, the road following him is costly. But there is no safer place to be than following the Son, whom the Father himself has told us, listen to him. Thank you for listening to the recording of the Dublin Bible Talks. You can join us in real time on Wednesdays at 1 p.m. Dublin Time on Zoom, bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks. That's bit.ly/Dublin Bible Talks.